Good morning and welcome to today's session on the course The History of English Language and Literature. In today's lecture, we continue to look at the development of English language from the early times onwards. And just in continuation with the previous lecture, we begin looking at the arrival of the Vikings, which happened in 876 AD. Vikings were a group of very violent nomadic tribes who were said to have arrived from Denmark and Norway, and they were generally constructed in popular imagination as a bloodthirsty frat party. So, one could imagine the kind of things that they did to the lands that they invaded, so much so that they were seen as a threat in most of the European and non-European neighboring states during that time. And the case with the land that Anglo-Saxons then inhabited was no different. So, we find the Vikings arriving in England soon after King Alfred's death, that is in 1016, and this is also the time, as we saw earlier on, the time when the Danes' law prevailed, which was from 1018 to 1042. So, the kind of influence that the Vikings had on the Anglo-Saxon language, on English language in general, it continues to be a matter of linguistic puzzle. In fact, it was their language, the language of the Vikings, known as the Norse language as a group. It was from that most of the Scandinavian contemporary languages have evolved as well. In terms of English language and the contribution to that the Norse language made to it, there were two major changes that we begin to note. The first one being the entry of Old Norse words into English language, and it's from the Vikings language that we still continue to use some of the pronouns like they and them. And also around this time, we find that the language begins to become simplistic in nature. The complexity that the Anglo-Saxon language had inherently built into it begins to wane away. And there also seems to have existed a confusion as to which language to use during that time, because they were England had become a sort of an absorbent ground of different kinds of languages which the different nomadic tribes and the invading tribes were bringing in. And in fact, many linguistics in the contemporary, they feel that much of English vocabulary, if we survey it in a foundational and etymological sense, there is a lot of Viking Norse influences built into it. And if we look at some of the very direct influences in terms of contribution to sentence structure and especially to vocabulary, many of the words for death and destruction, they are considered to have been contributed by the Vikings, and this also rightly proves the kind of this also indicates the kind of image that they had among different groups of people during that time. So, there is a lot of terms associated with violence, death, battle, warfare, etc., which are being attributed to the Vikings Norse language. The terms such as berserk, club, ransack, scathing, slaughter, all are said to have evolved from the Norse influence during the Viking invasion. During the period of Viking invasion, and also some of the words which are considered to be very central to the words that talk about English civilization. They are also said to have emerged from the Norse language, and there are multiple words for animals and landscapes, and even very simple words such as the adjectives flat, happy, low, ugly, weak, strong, a few verbs such as want, call, cut, die and take, and nouns leg, skin, skull, sky, etc. And one of the important contributions being the day of the week. Thursday has been named from the term that existed during the Viking period, Thor's Day. It's said to have been kind of a tribute to one of the pagan gods that they worshipped, and in fact, if we later on look at the way in which the days of the week, the names of the days of the week have evolved, we begin to see that most of them are tributes to the gods that these particular nomadic tribes and groups worshipped. And we also find the Vikings replacing some of the words which continue to be quite foundational to English language. For example, the Anglo-Saxons used to use a word called sinden in place of the verb are, and Vikings replace sinden with are, and we continue to use it even till date. And also, the Vikings and Norse language in particular is said to have contributed a group of linguistic words called known as kennings. Kennings is in fact a metaphorical expression which is also constructed in terms of a compound word. For example, one would use instead of body, the term bone house, which would be metaphorical and which would be using compound words as well. Let us quickly take a look at some of the kennings that exist even today, and some of the linguists find it quite interesting to engage with this word game as well. Let us quickly try and see whether we could make out what these different compound words signify. So, what could be life liquid? It is nothing other than blood. Wound see is also blood. Now, we can see that it is in fact a very literal, figurative and metaphorical way of talking about things. And what could be mind's worth? It is honor, and girl of the houses is wife, whale road is the sea. Now, you can see how interestingly this is being constructed, and wave swine is ship, sky candle, it is one of my favorites, it is the sun, the breather of the seas is the wind. If any one of you is interested in this, you could perhaps do a little more research and survey on this. This is one interesting way in which language has evolved, and one of the interesting ways in which we can even talk in many different ways even in the contemporary. So, kennings was one of the common contributions of the Vikings during that time, but it has not really survived into the English language, but this is a matter of intellectual but this is a matter of linguistic curiosity even in the contemporary. So, with that we in some way we begin to look at the general features of Old English language, and we begin to see that there was no single or agreed spelling that existed during the Old English period. In fact, different texts, the surviving manuscripts, if we scan through them, we find different texts having different spellings, and there is hardly any kind of standardization in place. And there is a heavy use of inflection thanks to the predominant Germanic influences, and inflections are endings in particular words which indicate grammatical functions. Contemporary English does not have any significant way of inflection. In fact, most of the European languages on the contrary still have. And due to inflections, the word order was quite flexible, because if we look at contemporary English, it is the word order, the verb in place in between different words, it is that word order which gives particular meanings. But with inflections, it was possible to reverse and have different kinds of word orders which would not affect the word meaning in any way. And the Old English, during the Old English period, the words had a very muscular quality. It was not soft, it becomes more soft, and the stress becomes a little different with the invasion of French into English language. And we also find that during the Old English period, most of the words were short, direct and forceful. This is particularly seen in Beowulf, which is incidentally the only surviving literary manuscript from those times. And the writing system was also very different, as we saw in the previous session. Old English is almost like a foreign language. It is quite distant from contemporary English. It does not look, sound or read like English at all. So, the writing system largely had Roman alphabet in place, and also a system of writing known as runes, which is again only a matter of linguistic curiosity in the contemporary. And the other interesting factor was that, unlike contemporary English, the grammatical gender was followed in most of the Old English dialects, and even today in some of the European languages we still have a grammatical gender. Let us quickly take a look at how grammatical gender operates. Let us take a quick look at how grammatical gender operated in Old English period. And in contemporary English, most of these words, concept nouns ending with ness, like goodness, wellness, etc., or these very simple words, they do not have any kind of gender attributed to them. But we find that in Old English period that was not the case. Concept nouns and certain words like hand and night, they had feminine gender, and words such as foot and day had masculine gender, and very interestingly words such as wife, woman, etc., had neuter gender. So, it is very interesting the way the language was organized during that time, predominantly because of the various influences including Germanic, Norse and also the other regional dialects that prevailed from the time the Romans left until perhaps the Norman conquest, which happens in 1066. And with the invasion of French from 1066 onwards, we find all of this undergoing a massive change, and also for the very same reason contemporary English is free from inflections, it's free from grammatical gender, it's free from the usage of kenning, so on and so forth. We also note that the strong verbs which were used in Old English period, many of them had changed over period into weak verbs. Strong verbs are these verbs which we now understand as irregular verbs, which have a different kind of which uses a different verb when we use the past and the past participle. Example, drink, drank and drunk. Weak verbs are the ones which the words to which we make the past tense by adding the ending ed to it. So, during the Old English period, we know that many of the strong verbs transformed into weak words, but however, we still have many words such as sing and sang built into English language, and they are generally called as irregular verbs. So, this also shows us that though some of the aspects in language continued to change, some of the aspects remained static even after many centuries had passed. So, with this we move on to look at the next big thing that happened in the history of English language and literature. It is the arrival of the Normans in 1066 AD. In fact, this Battle of Hastings, which happens in 1066 AD, which is also known as the Norman Conquest, it marks the beginning of Middle English period. Middle English language was characterized by a heavy influence of French, and when the Normans arrived, they brought with them a particular dialect of French, and this was a huge linguistic influence in the way the language was getting shaped from henceforth. And we also note that once the French language made its way into English language, the language system got a little more simplified in the sense that grammar rules got easier, but however spelling remained quite inconsistent throughout, and we find this getting standardized only much later with the arrival of the printing press. And during those times, during the Old English period as well as the early Middle English period, the spelling was as per the whim and fancy of each individual writer. In fact, if the writer used to follow a different dialect, the spelling would change accordingly. So, it was not seen as a problem at all. The problem of not having a consistent spelling was not seen as a problem at all. And around this time, we find Old English loses most of its consonant clusters, which is why if we listen to an Old English text today, we would note that a lot of consonant clusters are in place, making it sound more like a Scandinavian language than English. And there is also this particular thing that happens, a particular linguistic shift that happens during this period, which is known as metathesis. Metathesis is fundamentally nothing but the rearrangement of certain sounds from one place to the other. For example, in the Old English period, ask used to be axe and bird used to be bird. Ask had another form called axion, and thorough was thur. So, this change in word order happened due to various linguistic influences, and some even feel that other historical and geographical reasons are also built into it, but this process in general is known as metathesis. We shall not be going into the linguistic details of the same in this course. And this also brings us to another question. If the land of English people, England had been invaded by different nomadic tribes, and if all of those tribes were leaving behind the traces of their own languages and their own linguistic and dialectical varieties, so what were the languages prevalent by the time the Middle English period began? So, English, French, Latin and Greek were prevalent in Middle English period after the Norman conquest. There were residues from the tribes and the communities that had passed through England. There was also the current influences in place after the Norman conquest. So, who spoke what during this period? And English was generally used by commoners and lower classes because it was the language of the Anglo-Saxons, who were quite violently replaced first by the Vikings and later by the Normans. So, this was not considered as a standard form then. So, each one spoke according to his own dialectical or regional variety. There was French, which was the most important language of those times. This is we are talking about the Middle Ages, and it was the language of the aristocracy and the monarchy. For the same reason, French was a language of politics, administration and literature. In fact, we do not find any other language other than French dominating the royal court or even the law court during those times. And then there was this prevalence of Latin thanks to the increased contribution from Christian missionaries and Roman Church, and we find Latin being associated with clergy, and this is also the language of prestige and scholarship for many centuries in England, as we would come to see later. And there was also a little bit of Greek which was prevalent. This was primarily used by philosophers, scientists and medical practitioners. But however, we have noted even in our general survey of literature of the period that there was not much of a proper literary contribution during the Middle English period, but whatever little was available tells us about this the varied influences of these different languages getting played out in the literary field as well. Let us move on to a quick summary of this situation. During this period, we have a transformation happening from the Anglo-Saxon towards the Anglo-Normans. So, there is still the Anglo-Saxons prevalent in terms of people, language and culture, but they are being heavily influenced and even overtaken by the Anglo-Normans. So, in terms of vocabulary also we see this massive distinction. For example, words such as sheep, cow and the words related to animals, agriculture of manual labor etc. are associated with the Anglo-Saxons, because they were the ones who belonged to the working class and who were doing all kinds of labor during that period. And the words associated with the Anglo-Normans, because of the predominant French influence, they include words such as mutton and beef, and this distinction is quite important because the Anglo-Saxons used the words which were part of their everyday life, which included raising of livestock, doing agriculture etc. And the Anglo-Normans were using words which were common to them, because this was a kind of food which was being brought to them on a daily basis, and they did not have to involve themselves with the other kind of manual labor at all. So, this social distinction is evident in the way language evolves from the Norman period onwards, and later on we find that both of these words blend together and we have a fine mix of everything in contemporary English language. So, in this we begin to see the variety of influence that French had on English vocabulary. Most of the contemporary words that we use, the political vocabulary, the words of chivalry, terms for architecture, warfare, law, religion etc., all of them they owe its roots to French language. Also, we noted in the previous session that alongside Latin, French also had a major influence in contributing to the vocabulary of English language. And these were the predominant features of Middle English language. Spelling continues to be inconsistent and non-standard, and the syntax and imagery was getting predominantly biblical, and this talks a lot about the kind of influence that Christian missionaries and also the church had during the Middle English period. And in fact, the spelling began to resemble literal pronunciation during those times, and this was also influenced by the clergy as well as the Bible, because Bible then was meant to be a spoken text. It was mainly the clergy who began to think that Bible should be read out to the common people, so that even the illiterate and even the ones who cannot really understand Bible could find a way of coming closer to that. So, in that sense, a lot of biblical imagery and lot of biblical syntax began to be built into the structure of the language. At a later point, when we begin to see how the biblical translations also paved way to the growth of literature and growth of vocabulary, we will see in detail about the huge influence it had in terms of language and literature. And there were also grammatical conversions in place alongside prepositional semantic shifts. We shall not be going into the linguistic details of the same. And one significant thing about the Middle English language was that they did not have do constructions for questions or negatives. For example, do not enter, that kind of phrase was not available for use then. It was enter not or sit not. Do enters the the term do enters the construction of language only later during the early modern times. And this is also the time when they began to use capital letters for proper nouns and common nouns, and until then all letters were used only in the lower case, as we had already noted it in the previous session when we saw a text of the Lord's Prayer, that the entire text looks similar. In the same case, there is no intermittent lowercase and uppercase being used. So, capital letters are getting introduced, and also the emergence of comma is also significant during this time, but the use of comma was not standardized yet. So, in the texts which are available, in the manuscripts which are available, we find indiscriminate use of comma even affecting the meaning making process thereby. And this is a time when more and more French enters English language, and this influence is there to stay, as we would note at a later point of time. And the invasion of French makes the muscular Old English a little softer, and the stress patterns also begin to vary. And the one significant thing about the linguistic patterns in Middle English language is that the Germanic inflections are not noticed from the Middle English period onwards. Due to the invasion of French, word order becomes more important and the inflections are completely lost from language. This makes English this makes English an easier and a more flexible form as well. So, gradually we also see that towards the end of the Middle English period, English gradually replaces French in multiple ways, not just in linguistic terms, but also in a historical and socio-political realm as well. So, one of the important milestones being the Statute of Pleading in 1362. This was put forward by King Edward III in his parliament, and this paved way for the use of English in law courts. So, French was completely replaced. The argument being that many of the commoners failed to understand French language, and also it was getting increasingly difficult to do the proceedings entirely in French. So, English replaces French, and 1415 is also very significant because King Henry V ascends and he did not speak French. So, that was all the more reason for French to get entirely replaced by English even within the royal courts. So, English in that sense initially becomes a language of jurisdiction. It also becomes a language of government. And if we remember, this is also the time when the 100 Years' War was getting waged against France. So, there is a sense of nationalism which is getting consolidated. There is a political element built into this linguistic process as well, all of which we have noted in detail in some of the previous sessions. And this is also the time of Chaucer and Canterbury Tales, where English gets more prominence as a literary tongue than French is. And by 1425, there is enough evidence to show that English was getting used more and more by the educated upper class. It no longer remains as the language of the working class or the language of the laborers. It acquires certain kind of prestige and nobility. And during this period, many of the nobles also stopped sending their children for a special French education. By 1476, we find that all of this getting consolidated quite well with the invention of the printing, with the arrival of the printing press in England. We find the language getting standardized, and there is no longer a confusion about which form to use or which standard form to use for particular kinds of uses. So, this fundamentally is the story of English language during the early times. And we also note that, as we had noted in the many previous sessions, it's not just about the linguistic transformation and the linguistic shifts, but it's also about a certain kind of process aided by various historical, political, religious and social elements built into the structure of society, built into the structure of governance, so on and so forth. So, with this we come to an end of the various influences that we had noted in early Old English and Middle English period. So, we shall be continuing with this lecture at a later point when we begin to see more influences coming in and shaping English language through literary, cultural and other socio-political forces. So, this is all we have for the time being. Thank you for listening and see you in the next class.